Hello and welcome to Tao Radio.
Thanks for joining us. This is Mona and
Leah,
and we're here to take you on a journey with us while we explore the great sounds, music, arts and cultures from all around the world. Welcome. Today on Tao Radio, we are joined by Ben Edge, artist, filmmaker, author, musician, and one of the most distinctive chronicles and compelling voices of Britain's living and contemporary folklore today. Born in Croydon in South London and now based in North London, itself a quiet kind of folkloric migration. Ben's work explores folklore not as relic, but as lived experience. Through painting, film, writing, and pilgrimage, he has immersed himself in seasonal customs across the British Isles, from the Berrymen to the Padstow Obby Oss, from fire festivals to boundary walks. He's documenting communities not as spectacle, but from within. His acclaimed book, Folklore Rising, brings together over 200 works created through direct participation. This is not revival, neither is it reenactment. But folklore is something emergent, embodied, and evolving. His paintings are dense with symbolism, devotion, and proximity. They reveal ritual figures not as museum artifacts, but as our neighbors, alive in suburban streets, with industrial backdrops, and the contemporary landscape. Today, we explore folklore as a rising force, as cleansing, as reclamation, as an art practice, and as something deeply human. Welcome, Ben Edge.
Wow, thank you so much. What an introduction. And thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. There's finally some sun in London for the podcast, which is nice.
Which is beautiful because our first topic or theme we wanted to talk about was Folklore is Rising. And you've spoken about folklore not as revival, but as something rising. And I think for me, that language feels very intentional. Maybe even, I would say, almost political. And it's exciting for us at Tao because that's something that is aligned with how we think about contemporary folklore, that it's not nostalgia, but it's a continuity. So I think my first question to you is, what is rising for you? Why do you call folklore as rising?
Yeah, so I hear the term revival a lot around. And because I've spent so much time with these communities that practice their, age-old traditions and customs, what I found was, 10 years ago when I first was kind of turned on to this world and started traveling around, was that culture was thriving, but it was just out of the media, should we say. So I wasn't aware of it. I'd seen little things like Morris dancing and stuff, but I'd never connected the dots into this kind of seasonal practice that it's all linked to. So for me, I found it almost disrespectful this time to call it a revival, because in the 70s, for example, there was a great folklore revival where a lot of the folk traditions that we see today had lapsed and there was a gap in the practice of them. So that is a revival because they're reviving existing traditions. But in this case, I've seen it as a kind of rising, like a renaissance, because this world was already in abundance. It was happening everywhere I'd go. There was these incredible traditions. But what I see as rising is the fact that people that are from communities like myself and that perhaps didn't grow up with any obvious type of traditional folk culture. And what I've seen from going, I was 30 years old when I first going on the ritual trails about 10 years ago. And I felt so young, compared with a lot of the folklorist types that were coming along. You had the odd photographer. There was no feeling of any kind of movement or great interest around it. But as time passed, particularly post-lockdown, I'd say, I've seen a whole new generation almost like reclaiming their folk heritage. But what's different is I see a lot of personal inspiration going into it, more like a kind of artist, like myself, I suppose. So you see a lot of writers, a lot of artists, a lot of plays, a lot of Morris sites that have no history necessarily, but they're still taking from their immediate environments, and their costumes are inspired by trades perhaps that the people would have done ancestrally in the areas and stuff like that. So it's very much got one foot in tradition. I call it the folk renaissance because I see it almost as a kind of art movement in a way. And it's also arising in the sense that it's people that wouldn't have normally been so aware of the folk traditions and been inspired by them are actively seeking them out and then reinterpreting them to make something new that works for themselves.
I was just wondering what makes it attractive to them in the first place. How do they stumble upon it? Is it something quite similar to your stumbling upon it? And why do you think now a new generation is coming to it without these previous historic ties?
So I think what happened was there was a kind of movement that happened, whereas very few of us. So you kind of had myself out there documenting the rituals, putting them on Instagram, photographing, painting them. You also then had Morris sides like Boss Morris, for example, in Stroud, who are this all-female Morris dancing side that were doing it in a very new way. You had a zine called Weird Walk, who were writing about stones, and you had the Right to Roam movement, obviously Sam Lee and those kind of people that have already been doing, work around folk culture and nature and stuff. But it was all of a sudden like all these voices aligned and were brought together in zines such as Weird Walk. Zacchaeus Sewell's My Albion was a Radio 4 show, which had a lot of the people that were in Weird Walk too. So it kind of solidified a bit of the scene. And I think that from that, when we got to lockdown, there was already a bit of a kind of growing interest in it. But, basically the fundamental problems that we're facing. And I think when you're an artist, your job almost is to be ahead of the zeitgeist sometimes. You don't necessarily do it on purpose, but that's what you spend your life doing, investigating, reflecting, thinking about things. So all of a sudden, we found ourselves in this lockdown, and it was as if this sense of community grew out of it. I'm not going to talk about the bad sides of it, just the good sides in relation to the folk rising, should we say. And it was as if people fell in love with their country all over again. But with that is almost a sense of baggage with, the colonial past and stuff. And I know before I discovered the folklore world, it was quite easy just to kind of distance yourself from Britain and stuff. But I think through the folk culture, you start to kind of see the rays of light of the culture, and you realize that that is a kind of suppressed culture that somehow survived in spite of everything. So I think people connected to it on that front. And I also think we have obviously the global problem of, global warming, climate crisis, whatever you want to call it. And basically, to reverse that, you have to first of all care about nature, which involves caring about where you live. So you have to kind of find a way to get rid of that baggage that can stop you from loving where you live. And I think somehow in lockdown, all those things kind of came together. Also, people, I believe in this thing that Carl Jung introduced, this idea of the collective unconscious, and that there's this underlying language that is a visual language, shall we say, or a feeling that connects to everybody. We've all felt that feeling of something eternal within the everyday moment when you're watching a sunrise or something. And I think that these folk traditions, where people still need this feeling of being rooted to something bigger than themselves. And some of these folkloric characters, when you first see them, you don't quite know why they've had such an effect on you. But I think they're speaking to this collective unconscious. And, I'm interested in traditions all over the world. And you'll find similar practices, similar patterns in Africa, in Europe. It's remarkable, really. And I think that it's just this kind of language of the collective unconscious that when we plug into it, it makes us feel larger than ourselves. And also all the contemporary concerns, such as, our post-colonial age in Britain, this feeling of needing to connect to the land. I think somehow all of that can be unlocked within these living folk traditions.
I love that you brought up COVID, because COVID was that moment where we could reflect and
That's so
really
true.
examine some of these ideas or some of these myths, right? And some of them folkloric as well, that have held
Absolutely.
us maybe in stasis. And then looking deeper to the other ones. I mean, Leah and I, in many of our conversations, we're coming closer to the idea of folklore itself as some form of inherent wisdom our
Yeah.
collective
Well, that's
inherent
exactly what I
wisdom.
kind of mean by
Mm, mm,
the
mm,
collective unconscious.
mm,
Yeah, it's in
mm.
us somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that you talk about quite a lot about how you entered into this stream of exploration was stumbling upon a Druid ceremony at Tower Hill,
Yeah.
and that was a
Yes.
turning point in your life. And you immortalized that in your painting, The Autumn Equinox. And there's something almost initiatory about that moment. And I want to explore that with you a little bit, like about what shifted internally for you. Was it aesthetic, spiritual, psychological, or something harder to articulate? And I want to share also from my own experience. I went on a long tour kind of at the end of COVID. Me and my dog, we traveled around the UK and Europe, and we arrived in a lot of unfamiliar landscapes that carried deep resonance with me. There were feelings of belonging and longing that I experienced. Sometimes I'd even call it transcendence. When I'd reach the top of a hill after a long walk and something would shift. When I was
Mm.
lost and chose to merge with where I was instead of resisting it, and through that surrender kind of find my way again. And these were moments of existential difficulties I was navigating in my life, and that traveling helped me break that access to the landscape, the access to those sites. And so back to that question, I mean, did that encounter at Tower Hill carry something similar for you? A sense of arrival, a sense of initiation, a sense of realignment?
All those things really, and a lot of what you're talking about too resonate. So, I spent my 20s working all sorts of odd jobs, and also I was in a band, we did a lot of touring and stuff, but I'd lost my way, it kind of felt like. I was having a kind of crisis, like depression period, but it was more than just a regular kind of depression. It was like a feeling of being lost. As an artist as well, I'd been working on all these different types of paintings, and that felt like I didn't quite know where to go next. And that can cause a lot of anxiety in itself. There'd also been some tragedies of the family. It just felt like everything was a bit, going against me. The problem with depression, I find, from my experiences of it, is you unplug to the world, really. It all becomes about you. You just spend all day thinking about negative things. You're just so in your head as if the world doesn't exist and there's no kind of light, really. So I think I was already trying to root myself in some way, and I was taking these long walks across London and looking into the folklore of London, and London very much my family history, and it felt like I was connecting to something on that level. But it was when I had this experience of accidentally stumbling on the Druid ceremony, because I believe in sometimes these weird serendipitous moments happen that a lot of people call coincidence, but for me I don't really believe in coincidence in some respects. So it was as if I had to be there, it felt like. And what was so remarkable about it at that exact moment in time was it was quite a quick sensation of being snapped out of my kind of state of mind. So it was as if some light was coming in, and that excitement I hadn't felt for a long time. And what was so remarkable about it was actually in London. So, I could have been at Stonehenge and seen some Druids, and I think I'd have just seen it as a novelty reenactment. I wouldn't have perhaps connected to it at that moment. But because it was in London in my own kind of environment, and it was these people taking the time to connect with the seasons and, all that kind of talk that they were talking about spiritual harvest, like you lay the seeds now. It was the spring equinox, by the way, but I did paint the autumn equinox later. So I see why that you would have said that. But by the time the autumn equinox, the seeds are starting to come into fruition. So it was quite a healing thing to hear, because it's as if, I think we can get too stressed and anxious in life about everything having to be great now. But I love the fact that they're laying these seeds of hope for the future that will come into fruition. And it kind of takes the pressure off psychologically, I think. But also just the idea that we're in London and they were talking about London one day being reclaimed by nature and all this stuff. And yeah, it was just a kind of mad experience and completely woke me up out of the kind of mindset I was in. And I started then looking into who these group are, the Druids, you know, they had mentioned William Blake as a past member when they were reading out, and William Blake's always felt like a bit of a signpost in my life. Like my dad, where I spent a lot of time in my childhood, my dad lived is right next to Bunhill Fields, and I'd see the William Blake's grave and think, who is this guy? And when I was working for quite a few years on Carnaby Street in like mod shops and stuff, I would sit on the stairs of William Blake House where he had his first vision of God coming to him when he was a child and everything. So there was something about Blake's name. It all just felt quite, you know, very serendipitous indeed. And yeah, then I discovered that all these kind of small villages around the country and towns were practicing very unique customs that you wouldn't think on surface level that they're connected to the Druids in a way. But for me, it felt like it was. And then I started traveling around to the different communities, which was so exciting at the time, just to then be meeting people, kind of getting my confidence back through it and being so inspired by it. And you were talking earlier about, I think you used the word surrender, was it? Surrender when you're to the landscape?
Yeah.
It was a bit like that. It was kind of surrendering to my own inspiration and not worrying about, you know, if you had asked me to do a podcast in this first year, I wouldn't have been able to really tell you what was going on in my head and why I was following it. It was as if the making of the art now was all about the journey itself. So instead of like overly intellectualizing, having to have all your ideas before, it was as if you were on a journey, and that's how I like to work. And I think that's actually what art's about in its purest form. So yeah, just so many things.
Can I jump
I
in?
think,
And I haven't really formed a question, but it's very evocative what you say. And I think that moment of encounter, and from what is in the paintings that you paint, but also in the folk traditions that I've also stumbled across, it's surreal, but it's real at the same time. It's so absurd,
yeah,
yet it's no longer something in a book or once upon a time or from a fairy tale. It's in your face, isn't it? It's in front of you. And I think, you know, all
yeah,
carnival cultures offer us that. And when you talk about snapping back, this sort of antidote to depression, because it's so bright, it's so alive, it's so childlike and fantastical. And for once, you know, it's not repressed and you're not told, well, that stops when you're 6 years old. The imagination
yeah,
can live right now in adulthood, and this hope that you describe when the seeds are planted for the future, that's so empowering to us as a
yeah,
collective. And it's empowering because it's tied to nature. No, it's this
yeah,
coming into how we operate as organic beings, and as part of our environment, we synchronize with it. So I think that is maybe like the strongest antidote to depression, which, as you say, is this kind of suction downwards and inwards. So the magic of it is something that I wish that everybody gets to experience, because folk can be seen as something fuzzy and old fashioned, but this reawakening that you talk about and new generations coming to it, I think it's happening in many cultures. I was in Poland for a few years, and there they have a huge revival of their folk dances from the new generation and the young people. And it really is awakening, sort of something is awakening across the
absolutely.
planet in that sense.
Yeah, you just inspired me to say something myself. I recently went to Bulgaria, a place called Banks, and then also to Switzerland, Ernash, to explore some folk traditions there. And one of the things that I found really interesting about starting to branch out to some European traditions was, I think the reason that the folk culture in Britain resonated with me so much was not really because it was in Britain, but because it's a celebration of the diversity of culture. So every town you go to or village, there's something slightly different about it that makes it exciting. But also you connect as well because there's something similar too. So it's an echo of the real nature of what it is to be a human being, because every single one of us is uniquely different. You know, twins can grow up in the same house and become two very different people. There's something inherently unique about everything in nature, I suppose you could say. And these things are a manifestation of that. But what's so fascinating about them are the fact that they're almost like a collective dreaming of a community that comes into being, a kind of manifestation of what that place is, its identity. And I think by breaking down the binaries of borders, I kind of did that here first. So like, it didn't feel any different when I went to Switzerland to it did to when I first went to Padstow. I still felt like this kind of outsider, but also interested and connected. And I think that there's something about falling in love with your country through folklore that inevitably leads to falling in love with the whole world, because it's about that beautiful differences and that little bit of creative spark that we all have that is voiced and comes out in different ways. And it's what makes the world an amazing place, isn't it? You know?
And reducing that chasm between us and nature is such a fantastic reflection of folklore itself, and you can't race through it. You can't speed through it. It's all about procession and walking through it. And this
Mm.
ties really beautifully to what I wanted to talk to you about, which is walking as ritual, because as you went to these different places, you had to literally slow down and walk through them. Much of the folklore also that you beautifully paint involves that walking procession, such as the Berryman or beating the bounds or all the seasonal circuits. So in the walking as ritual, do you feel that that's a form of embodied knowledge? What is it in the way that we walk through and we take part in these processions is something that the archive can't understand?
Yeah, so I suppose for me, the first thing that always springs to my mind, and one of the folk traditions that I've been to more than any other, I'd say, was the Buryman in South Queensferry in Scotland. And what it is about it for me is, I suppose that word that you mentioned earlier keeps coming back to me. It's a type of surrender, because I turn up in the morning and you've just kind of given yourself to this for the day. So you're going to follow the Buryman. And it's a remarkable experience because you go through all sorts of amazing emotions. You meet people, you chat to people. At times, everyone's just kind of quiet, following this green, almost nature god, it feels like. And I think it's just, you're just alive. You're just kind of, you're part of something important and bigger than yourself. And it just makes sense in a way that's very hard to articulate. I think that's why I have to paint the pictures, because when I film them and take photographs, it's kind of just a documentary experience. But I think my paintings, or what I hope they do, is they have that more of an internal experience that you have. It's like a walking meditation in many ways. And it kind of goes through all the emotions. You talked about suppression. Yeah, there's the childlike quality to it, which sometimes I think people are more themselves when they're wearing the masks. And then there's also the side of it where you actually, there's a lot of life and death moments in a lot of these things. Like, they'll stop at a house and everybody has a quiet moment for somebody that would have been a big part of that tradition. And there's little touching moments where you'll go to, I remember in South Queensbury, this lovely couple who every year, the Buryman goes to, and the lady reads a poem she writes each year for the Buryman, and her husband comes out in a top hat. And then when you go back the next year and it's just her coming out, it kind of makes me choke a little bit talking about, he's obviously passed away. So there's a lot of things you face of kind of life and death, and even the whole cycle of life, isn't it? Like, the Buryman comes out, everyone's excited. There's elation at the end of the day, and then the suit's removed, and it's a kind of death, but then also a kind of rebirth. And I think in life, all our myths in every culture always relate to this idea of death and rebirth. And I think that we have many death and rebirths in life. It's not just something that comes at death, and we see it in the seasons, in the spring. So I think, yeah, it just taps into so many things that you just, for a little bit of time. And I think it's so healthy for a community every year to enter that world where you're letting go. I think it's definitely a cleansing of the community. And it's no surprise that a lot of these things are about taking away bad luck, taking away bad spirits, because it's as if you're kind of cleansing a community and yourself in the process. And I think rituals, they're important to do that, to mark things. It's very hard to do it without the procession, isn't it? But it doesn't really sink in. But there's that act of really, beating the bounds, for example. It was originally for children to know their parish, where they can play, where they can't play. So they were literally beating they're beating their parameters into their heads. So, it's a bit like that, isn't it? in all things.
And we need to have shared rituals is also what I feel is relevant here, that you can create your own ones, but that actually combining all of them and having the force of one cohesive ritual is where a lot of those bigger lessons that are innate can kind of drop in. And it's funny because, yeah, as you say, when you take a photo or you use a camera, the archive is instant. But then when you paint a moment or when you summarize your experience through a painting, and I would assume another kind of ritual, how does that sit with you as someone who uses both forms? You know, which languages are you speaking when you're using digital capture, and what is happening when you're actually in the creation of a painting? How long does it take? What happens for you as the artist on those two fields?
Yeah, so painting's what I've always kind of set out to do. You know, I see myself as an artist, a painter. So painting, you're kind of like expressing your inner world in some respects. You know, even the themes you're drawn to, they say something bigger about what you're interested in, what you're trying to say. That's why, you know, when you go to a retrospective, you see the early work of an artist and the late work of an artist. It can be very different, but there's a whole voice in there in a way. So I think coming from a background of painting all sorts of folk, I was very interested in everyday people always. So I grew up with a really eccentric family that would tell me all these amazing stories growing up. And that was a kind of folk tradition in our family, storytelling, oral storytelling, passing down these great stories about ancestors and things like that. So I suppose my work's always been about investigating the creativity of individuals, often about the creative impulse. I did a whole series all about outsider artists, you know, a term basically for people that start making art, often under traumatic experiences, that would never consider themselves an artist, but yet they're driven to do it. And so I was doing these portraits that I called livescapes, where I'd put the figure at the center and kind of unravel their life, almost like, you know, my psychological explanation of what made this person, but also hoping that it says something bigger about life in general with each subject for all of us to connect to. And I think that's basically my approach to painting, whatever I paint. And folk traditions is just something that's almost like a muse to me, you know, like it's what inspires me. It's the language that allows me to talk about the things that are on my mind and everything. But when I was going to the rituals, you know, I was taking pictures to paint from source material, but then I found myself just taking pictures because I wanted to capture something that looked incredible or just a touching moment. Or so that was a natural progression to start taking pictures too. You know, I don't necessarily exhibit my photos, but when I was making the book, it was the perfect opportunity to bring them together. And then the film side came because you do just initially want to document and share it and say, wow, look at this incredible thing that I'm looking at. And I think when I first started putting those clips on Instagram, they really did resonate with people. It was a big springboard. So somehow all of these elements became part of my practice. And, you know, it's kind of accidental, really. People call me a folklorist. I always say I'm an accidental folklorist. I never set out to be a folklorist. So, yeah, I'm fundamentally a painter, and somehow all these other dimensions have started coming in.
I love the storytelling about the ordinary folk, and that's something that many families they don't have access to, that storytelling nature. You know, many families sit in quite a lot of silence. Maybe there's everything along the spectrum. But I feel like to notice the details in the people around you and the world around you is such a special, unique quality. You know, storytelling is a very sacred form of interaction and communication. And then I suppose it opens your eyes to kind of the world in front of you constantly. So what we see in some of your works is a theme of not the fantasy world, but sort of the everyday world or the urban landscape as a canvas as well. And it seems, as an outsider to the work, like maybe even a juxtaposition, because you have the nature and the characters that come from the myths and then maybe these rituals embody through the costumes. And then you have this cold, hard world that we're all living in London or in the big cities. Can you talk to us a little bit about that, about the relationship between the two?
Yeah, so obviously it began as being amazed by that juxtaposition. You know, like when I first saw the Druid ceremony, one of the reasons it connected to me was because people were wearing everyday sports trainers walking past a KFC. It was something that was a world that I'm part of. And I think the more that I, went deeper and deeper into this stuff, I had perhaps separated the human race from nature. So I think a lot of my work is about fusing that gap. And some people don't like me saying this, but I actually consider the city as part of nature, because every single element has come from the earth. And by knowing that, I think you become more responsible for what you use, how you do it, and how you go about it. Because I think if we see ourselves as separate from nature, it is just this endless resource. But actually, the city is a kind of ecosystem in itself that we've created naturally, really, through innovations from human nature. So I think for me, I am trying to speak of this idea of this man-made nature that we're part of, and that we've gone too far with it. And there's hope within these folk traditions that we can kind of pull it back and find a more balanced ecosystem within it. Because let's face it, we're not all going to be able to go back to that old-fashioned way of life and living in cabins in the woods and things like that. So it's an acceptance of where we are as a human race, and that we're part of nature, and the whole thing is part of nature, whether we like it or not. And we have this level of consciousness that we can make the right decisions.
I love that because it ties into the philosophical divide, man versus nature, or man within nature as
Mm,
part of nature. And then what you're talking about is that the cities are here, and that now we need to honor what is here, that actually our buildings are made of stone that come from the mountains. Our streets,
mm,
all the components that make our city life work, then if we honor those in that ecosystem, how do we use it more wisely in terms of stopping the overconsumption, right? Reusing what we
absolutely.
have currently, coming up with more innovative and imaginative ways, not to just pull down things and then go blast more mountains, but how do we really reconfigure them and really kind
Exactly.
of go back into that inner knowledge that we have, which all our ancestors also had, which is, oh, how can I reformat this for something else? How
Exactly
can I
that.
reconfigure it for something else, to stop the waste?
Exactly. What hope to kind of trigger in people's heads, by putting those juxtapositions together. And they are juxtapositions, but they're not actually, because it's stuff I've witnessed.
And I was just kind of thinking that that in itself is a form of healing, to
Mm,
actually kind of start thinking about things from that framework and reframing the whole conversation,
mm,
right? And then we all have power. Like you said, we all have
absolutely.
the power to honor our belongings, just to give them more life, to gift them
Exactly.
if we don't
Yeah.
need them. And I just love that. Thank you so much for that. I just love it.
No,
Um,
thank you.
I wanted to touch on something that you mentioned about the outsider, because you talked a little bit
Mm,
about these outsider artists. And yeah, and I know that in other interviews in your writing, you've talked about Bosch and the Flemish primitives and
mm.
a naive and outsider artist influences. And I wondered whether you think that because folklore uses some of those languages, the symbolic density, the detail, which details do
Mm.
matter.
Mm.
Is it also one of the reasons it remains outside of dominant power structures, and also the reason why it persists? And I just wanted you to touch on that.
Yeah, well, the term that I'm trying to make this folk movement have as a whole is the folk renaissance. And the show I was working on about 10 years ago, I called the folk renaissance. And the reason that I called it that was because I felt like culture, and still is, too obsessed with this idea of celebrity and external validation and stuff. And we're all guilty of being sucked into that world. But the characters I was looking at were what I would call folk heroes. So it was outsider artists, circus performers, even Hastings fishermen I was painting and stuff like that. And I was like looking into their stories. And while I was painting a lot of these pictures, I was going through that really severe depression, and the strength in their lives gave me strength really to keep going. And I think that what is powerful to bring in the idea of folk art and Renaissance art, and how, for me, they connect. The Northern Renaissance is what I'm particularly inspired by, Bosch and people like that, is that there is this love and attention to detail in the work. So for me, when I'm painting grass, I want to paint every blade of grass, because I actually see a weird coalition with the eras where nature's most neglected. You'll look at portraiture and there's no attention to the backgrounds. It's just all about the human being. So there's something in that for me, that you're caring about everything equally. It's all part of the nature in its own way. And I think with the Bosch imagery, why it speaks to me so much is because we're now moving into a post-Christian age in some respects in the everyday, even though it is still a popular religion around the world with some people. But it then enters the world of mythology, because, Joseph Campbell, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Joseph Campbell, but he's one of my big kind of inspirations. He studied all the world's religions and the commonalities between each. And his definition of mythology is someone else's religion, which I thought was a great way of explaining it. And when we now look at these Christian images, because we don't know the stories, they're not part of our everyday education. They transcend direct meaning, in a sense that this is what you're meant to think. So I think that those images are now entering that collective unconscious I talk about. They can become images about all sorts of things, about anxieties at the time, and I connect to those anxieties and things like that. So for me, that imagery really speaks to me. And there's something then also in the folk art where people paint from themselves in a kind of natural way almost. It's like they're revealing their own inner natures. So I think that for me was what I tried to combine in my work. I don't think I've got a clear answer, but I can dance around an answer.
I'd love to know if, because it might be a weird question, if through art some magic has happened through the making of ritual and art and so forth. Because when you spoke about, where the nature is most abandoned in the portraiture, there is no landscape in the background. In actioning these impulses to create on the canvas or in the artistic mediums, have you noticed reality shift in the real world, like surrounding it or touching it, or in the lives of people at all?
Yeah, well, I think images are so important. They're a different level of language, a universal kind of language. And for whatever reason, we need those images. And I think there's stuff that our work will say, whatever that may be, painting, that will actually be drawn from the subconscious too. Like, I have to kind of catch up with my own ideas, it feels like. Like, I don't always know what I'm trying to say, but later it kind of reveals itself to me through the act of making it. So there's a magic in that, to make the internal external and to connect with people through it, I also think that there are images, but that whoever's created them has somehow tapped into something so universal that they'll last hundreds of years. That's magic, like The Scream comes to mind by Edward Munch. You never forget that image. We all feel it and understand it on some weird level. And then what else comes to mind? I'm quite interested in the Paleolithic cave art. And, now we buy our meat from the supermarket and stuff like that. But for those people, they were killing these wild animals and they revered them. So the early cave art is a kind of spiritual worship of these animals and creating this kind of magical existence where they were going off into a different world. And then we started creating images of shamans and things. So it was like the marriage of the wild and the man-made and stuff like that. So I don't think without that art, they would have been able to find meaning in the death of these animals that they considered their kin in their religion and things like that. So I think there's magic and understanding. We need images as a race. And I think that is magic in itself.
Very beautiful answer.
But yeah, I feel that folklore in all its manifestation, whether it be through art and music and elsewhere, it is that. It's our very deep need for meaning. And what's our deep need for meaning for? That's the language by which we connect with each other, right?
Exactly.
By which we
Yeah.
care. And it's become even more urgent because we really live, like you said, in a world that puts so much importance on vacuous things like celebrity and finds other things that provide us with meaning and strength as unworthy of our time. People are struggling. And that's the truth. And we see
Yeah.
it around us, right? In the fragmentation, in the commodification. And what's beautiful about what you're doing, Ben, is that you resist that. You resist the
Mm.
categorization. You resist the simplification. You yourself being an artist and whether that be through paint or filmmaking or musician, you are also resisting that categorization of being genreified in a way.
Yeah.
And I like to think of our work in terms of like contemporary artists who honor folklore as a return to wholeness and a
Yeah.
way to both hold all the things of ancestry and experimentation, of ceremony and nightlife and day life, all in the same body without that tension, right? Without that need to fragment it. And I'd like you to just kind of speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. So I suppose, like I say, because I had this really, dark night of the soul, shall we say, which actually a lot of mythological stories are often about, because I think it's these rites of passage we have in life that are almost needed to kind of shed a skin almost. So when I emerged out of that through this folkloric journey, it felt as if I'd been led there. So I'm going to sound all mystical now. So it felt like my responsibility in some respects to go and do this. And through it, this kind of incredible world revealed itself to me that I'd forgotten, that was in me all along. I think of that kind of famous analogy of Wizard of Oz, where she has to go on this mad journey to come back to herself at the end and realize that it was there all along. And I think that's what folklore is about. It's, you can go off on these mad processions, these mad spiritual quests almost through it, but you always return home, like you say, to yourself. But you're back in your apartment, wherever you live, you're the same environment, but because of that journey, something of yourself gets revealed to you. And I think that's perhaps what I'm always trying to do in my work. If I'm making a portrait of someone else, I'm trying to dig deep into the human experience of life and this kind of almost unspoken language that connects us all, and trying to reveal mine, a bit more of it in each thing that I do. And I think that is kind of what my folkloric journey's been. It's like I'm still here in London, but I'm changed. And I had to go on that journey to be here. Without that, I wouldn't be who I was today, and I wouldn't have this, almost discovered my voice in some respects as an artist. It will obviously evolve and change, but it's just that you feel like you found your calling, really.
Which is exactly, I believe, Joseph Campbell's study of the hero's journey, is it not? That you go off into the wild and face
Yes.
challenges and redeem the secret information from beyond the cave that's guarded by the demons, which are your reflections, and then you take it home, that treasure. And
Yeah,
everything is different. Everything's the
exactly.
same, and everything is different.
Yeah. Well, we're really connected with Joseph Campbell for that hero's journey story, because you start to see it in everything, don't you? In popular culture. Star Wars is a kind of mythological story when you
Yeah,
start delving into it, you
big
know?
time. June, another one.
Yeah.
It will probably bring you back into what you wanted to say, I would imagine, but that you've mentioned a few times this post-Christian world and the role of folklore and revivalism and people coming back together. And, what is this craving that is at the core of human existence about? And, maybe the big cinema screens do it as well, and the musicians do it as well, you as well as painting and being a filmmaker and a photographer. As a musician, what do you think is at the center in that human craving that art delivers?
Yeah, so I think if we were to look at, say, a folk tradition as a kind of almost a group performance piece in some respects, you could say it is a kind of art-based activity. I always say this, when I first started going to these traditions, I felt like I was taken back to the birth of art, because art came around through our need to create these specially charged objects that enhance an experience. Or like I mentioned earlier, the Paleolithic art, it's very ritualistic to paint these animals as part of this cycle of life and stuff like that. So I feel that there's this need for mythologizing our landscapes to give them that importance and everything. And to keep quoting Joseph Campbell's, his view is that the artist's role is to be the myth maker in culture, because since the Industrial Revolution, things have moved fast that we've outlived all our myths, because myths take centuries to ferment, shall we say. So now we're in an age where we don't really have these myths to live by in the same way. So I think perhaps what I'm trying to do is fill that role in unearthing these mythologies that are still there and flicking around. And I think that the Christian mythology really resonates with me, because there's something in those images that connect to me, that say something bigger about the human experience beyond the religious side. And that is echoed in the actual traditions themselves. So when I made my film, my model was to go to the community, enjoy myself, get immersed in it all, interview some of the key figures that I've noticed around in the day. And whenever you ask them about the history, they'll say, well, the story goes this, and there's this other story, this, and this. But what's important is that it's happening and we just do it anyway. There's a key in that for me, because, you know, we all have these organized religions and things throughout the world and throughout history, and time passes and their importance fades. But the actual ritual enactments that happen within the faith, that create the communities for people, that create the meaning in the lives of people, that create that plug into something larger than themselves, or whether it's a god or the universe or whatever you want to call it. I think that somehow just by doing these things, you feel closer to it. And that outlives the organized element of it. So say one of the traditions I went to apparently was started because two ladies were walking across a field of gentry ladies, and a bull charged at them and nearly killed one. And a hare ran over at that exact moment and stopped the bull and saved her. And as an act of thankfulness to this hare that she believes was sent by God, she pays every year for a pie to be made for the peasants of the town. You know, traditionally they've been called peasants. And these things they call bottles, that are actually wooden kegs of beer, to be shared throughout the town. As time's passed, that tradition's grown into basically a mass game where two neighboring villages fight for this keg of beer, basically, and people are getting knocked out and stuff. But it's what the whole community lives for. You know, they love it. But that story is just a bit of mythology now. Whether it's true or not is irrelevant. But the fact that they do it every year because they love the tradition, and it gives their kind of identity to their town, and it's almost like a kind of rite of passage for the young men to go and take part, and then it's like they really are of that town, and they're kind of passing into adulthood. It's something they would have watched their fathers do. So there's all these elements to it. So I think that our search for meaning often becomes doctrines that we write down that do as much harm as good. But actually what always somehow survives is the actual physical act of doing these things. And that's where you see the benefits to the communities and things. It's hard to describe, but I think I'm getting somewhere close to what I'm trying to articulate.
I think it makes a lot of sense. You know, you can have what's written in a story or told in a legend, but what has actually happened, the events that we've experienced together,
Yeah,
it becomes the fabric of who we are, actually. You don't get that from books.
exactly.
And I wonder
Yeah.
about, you mentioned briefly industrialization and how these things run in tandem somehow. And the timing of your work couldn't be more poignant in that sense, because, you know, we're living another massive industrialization. I think it's the fourth boom or something with AI. So how do you see folklore 25, 10, 15, 20 years from now? What do you think? Is it going to stay something that's eternally recognizable, or is it going to change into something of another
Yeah.
matter?
Well, we're at a threshold with it at the moment that actually does worry me sometimes, because I think popular culture want to absorb it and absorb its meaning through the process. And that worries me. So I think what's important is that people take responsibility for what it's truly about. And when you go into the city and you see these community gardens and you'll see these little touches people are doing, rewilding a field, all that stuff for me is part of this. And I just think we need to keep the meaning of what it's about. It's not just about wearing a silly costume and dancing through the street and that will look good on your TikTok or something. Do you know what I mean? So I worry about that. And I think that people need to like take responsibility and see this as a resistance against all that and not let that resistance be absorbed within this culture, because we all have that innate need to be recognized, to be loved. And this celebrity culture is an empty promise really of that, isn't it? Do this, you'll get there, get loads of followers, life will be great. And folklore seems to be a good way to get followers at the moment. So
Yeah.
it does worry me slightly. So I feel a bit worried sometimes about how it's going to go. I just think we need to keep reminding ourselves what it's about. And that's what I'm here to do, and
Yeah.
not let it get consumed by the consumption, side of ourselves.
Completely. And something that we feel very strongly about is the role of like custodianship and guardianship.
Mm,
That's very strongly with responsibility. And on the other side of it is freedom. And a lot of how we talk about folklore is that it's movement, it's migration, both spatially and temporally, right?
mm,
And so then that means that we can't own it or co-opt it in
no.
itself if it moves. So yes, and the tension with that modern way, this kind of very consumerist model that people are, like you said, TikToking, it's an attempt at ownership.
Mm, yeah.
And I think, the more of us kind of talk about it in terms of temporary custodianship and responsibility, I think
Mm,
that may be part of the role that we're all doing at the moment, having these conversations through your art, through your filmmaking,
mm.
bringing that kind of genuine movement through time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the conversations are very important because we all do it. We all post stuff. So it's hypocritical to say like they're wrong, I'm right type of thing. But I think it's just remembering, do all that stuff, but just remember what it's truly about. Because it has helped. The internet was a great thing for me with Instagram and everything. I discovered a whole community of people that I would never have met. It's like a kind of virtual rock and roll club. When you're a teenager and you get interested in a certain type of music, you meet all the characters that didn't go to your school necessarily, but you all connect. And it feels like your life's begun in some respects. Or it did for me anyway. But you know what I mean? So I feel like the internet's great as well. It's like anything. It's about, like you say, talking about it, thinking about it, and not letting it go too far the other way. It had its place, but it's just important to remember what it's truly about. And, obviously, like I say, the consumerism element, and you see that a lot of like brands and things or pop stars start trying to use it. But that is not for me what it's about. For me, it's about the real everyday people that aren't part of these worlds of trying to get famous. They're just people that are expressing their communities themselves through their creativity, and also expressing the joy of being alive in some respects, just being plugged in to this earth. It's more deep than this side of culture now that's all about, trying to fill some kind of void, I suppose, to be noticed, to be seen. But what's beautiful about these folk traditions is everybody's seen in the communities I go to. They all play their little role in it. It's beyond that. It's higher than that, in my opinion.
And as you described, the annual circuits that you do when someone's missing, they're noticed. This is actual recognition of the individual
Yeah,
through presence
exactly.
and absence. It's eternal.
Yeah,
So all of
exactly.
that being said,
Yeah.
where can people find you and follow and engage and digest your beautiful materials, musical, film,
So,
visual?
yeah. So you can find my website, www.benedge.co.uk, and my films are up on there, and all my paintings and stuff like that. I've got a shop, but I'm actually in the process of redoing it all, so there isn't anything available at the moment. Music, you can get, my records and stuff I think that in most record shops, you can get them online at least, rather than in the physical stores and stuff, and then the streaming platforms. And then my Instagram's really the only social media tool I really use. So Ben Edge Art on Instagram.
That's so beautiful. Ben, I've really enjoyed our conversation today, and I just wanted to thank you for care, the devotion, and the presence you bring through just sharing with us the living folklore and traditions and reminding us that folklore isn't behind us, but rising
Yeah.
all around us. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you both as well.
Brilliant speaking with you. Thank you.